When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome brought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
There once was a people, let's call them the people. The people used stories to interpret their lives. Stories of where they came from, stories of where they were going, stories that told them how to be happy, and stories that told them where they were. One One day, a long time ago, one of the people saw another one of the people holding something shiny. "I want it," said one of the people. So he took it. When he got back home that night, the rest of the people were amazed. "Because I have a shiny object," he proclaimed, "I am in charge now." You see, the first story said that the way to be happy is to rule over others. But every time that story was attempted, people were unhappy because the rulers oppressed them. So a second story was invented: let's overthrow the rulers. And this story didn't work either, because it just turned the tables, putting new rulers in charge and putting new people under oppression. So another story began in which those old revolutionaries withdrew into their own isolated spaces and began to judge the world. Nothing changed. These island communities ran on the same old stories, some clawing their way to the top, others trying to pull them down and replace them at the top, and others building shiny object factories that filled the air with smoke and made everyone cough, not just the people, but the animals and even the trees. Meanwhile, the domination story and the isolation story had a business merger which resulted in an experiment. If they could get rid of the people they didn't like, those who looked or sounded different, or whose customs weren't like their own, surely that would fix things. Of course, that story just led to more suffering. Suffering for those who were blamed and targeted and felt unsafe. And suffering for those who did the blaming and targeting because they missed out on the gift of the rainbow. They lived in a gray world. The people still weren't happy, and they knew it. So they began to, sorry, I got distracted. They began to create a new, look at that, a shiny object. How lovely, I would like one of those. How can I get one? A lot of years went by. The people tried to convince themselves that things were okay by accumulating things, toys, or nations. It was all the same to them. Some of the people knew such things don't heal the soul. And the other old stories hadn't gone away either. The people kept hurting and hurting each other. So a sixth story was created that says if we can't find peace, security, and happiness by ruling the world or overthrowing the rulers or withdrawing into isolation or getting rid of a minority or by accumulating shiny objects, then let us never forget our sorrow or the pain that others have caused us, for no one has ever suffered like us. The people would make sure that no one would ever forget that they were the victims, that their suffering was their very identity, and that no one had suffered as much as them. And if you try to tell them that others have suffered too, they might kill you. And then something new. A poet came to town. A storyteller who knew that the domination story, the revolution story, the isolation story, the purification story, the accumulation story, and the victimization story were all destined to fail. They were destined to fail because they invited every human being who is already interdependent with every other human being and even with the earth itself, to pretend instead that we are in competition. The poet knew how to build things, like tables where we could all sit and eat together. She taught that the people most oppressed by the 6 stories should be the most honored. She taught that our differences aren't a reason for shame, punishment, or exclusion, but instead, they are marks of what makes us most lovable. She invited the people to join her in forming a new community where status would depend on service and domination would be replaced by equitable community, where revolution would begin in the heart and would lead to reconciliation, not revenge, transforming the process by which we live and learn, where deadening isolation would be replaced by rejuvenating silences, where we would learn from and celebrate folks on the margins, where we would share, not possess, and heal each other's wounds in a new story of power with, not power over, of collaboration, not competition, of beauty, not belligerence. The poet had a radical idea, the seed of a 7th story that will heal the world. The earlier 6 stories all claimed that the path to peace, security, and happiness was about winning, us over them, us overthrowing them, us staying apart from them, us cleansing ourselves of them, us having things that they don't, or us being more important than them because of our competitive suffering. But in the 7th story, the story of reconciliation, we still get to win, just not at anybody else's expense. In the 7th story, human beings are not the protagonists of the world. Love is. In the 7th story, humans are participants in something far bigger than being reduced to dominating others for one group's gain, or the pursuit of happiness through revolutions that replace one dominance with another, or isolation or purity or being a victim or gaining possessions. In the 7th story, humans are participants in the biggest thing that has ever happened, of the evolution of the good, of the expansion of consciousness, to include the restoration and healing of all things. The story of love. It's a story in which some of us know that our purpose is not merely self-interest, but the common good. Some of us, for all of us. They killed the poet, of course. The 7th story was too much to take for people with visions limited to the narrow circles of self. But the poet did not actually die. Her story is alive, right now. The story lives wherever someone reveals the other stories as failures. The story lives every time someone lives for all of us, or offers a glass of cold water to a thirsty stranger, or a blanket for a naked person, or engages in sacred practices of friendship, lament, and hope. The story lives wherever there are exchanges of power and gifts between the strong and the vulnerable, creating community. The story lives wherever there are artistic endeavors that show us we're not alone and tell us where to go next and remind some of us to live for all of us, because there is no them.